The restaurant was buzzing with the chatter of high-stakes deals and the laughter of the powerful. Alina Harper sat at the center of it all, yet she felt disconnected, as if the world around her were merely a dull hum in the background. Her fingers trembled slightly as they brushed against the envelope in her purse, the paper cool and smooth beneath her touch. It had been with her since the morning, a reminder of everything she had lost. Alina took a deep breath, willing herself to focus on the conversation at the table. Her colleagues were discussing the latest business expansion plans, and she tried to nod along, offering smiles at the appropriate moments. But her mind kept drifting to the invitation. The glossy surface, the hearts intertwined with elegant monograms, Alex and Chloe. The names stood boldly at the center, mocking her with their cruel confidence. She knew she had to open it, even though she dreaded what was inside. And so, with a mix of determination and anxiety, Alina slipped her hand into her purse, her fingers tightening around the envelope. Slowly, she brought it out, resting it on her lap beneath the table, hidden from view. Her colleagues continued to talk, oblivious to the turmoil brewing beneath her composed exterior. She traced the monograms with her thumb, her heart aching with the weight of betrayal. Chloe had once been her best friend, the one who knew every secret, every dream, every fear. They had spent endless nights together, whispering under the stars about their futures, about love, about everything that mattered. But now, Chloe had become the embodiment of Alina's worst nightmare. With a final sigh, she tore the envelope open, the ripping sound barely audible over the noise of the dinner. She slipped out the invitation and unfolded it, the elegant script glittering under the low lights. It was written in a saccharine, over-the-top rhyme that only deepened the wound. Alex and Chloe were getting married, and they wanted her there, front and center, to witness their happiness, as if they were oblivious to the heartbreak they had left in their wake. A pang of jealousy shot through Alina's chest, sharp and suffocating. She could almost hear Chloe's laughter, mocking her, as if she were saying, "Look at what I took from you, and look at where I stand now." Alina crumpled the invitation in her hands, her fingers trembling with a mix of rage and helplessness. She hated that Chloe still had this power over her, that she could make her feel so small, so broken. Suddenly, Alina heard her name. She looked up, startled, and met the concerned gaze of Jack Montgomery, her boss. He was sitting across from her, his dark eyes softened by an unusual gentleness. "Is something wrong, Alina?" Jack asked, his voice low enough that it wouldn't attract the attention of the others. He glanced at her lap, where the crushed invitation rested, and raised an eyebrow. What was that in the envelope? Alina flushed slightly, feeling exposed. She shook her head, trying to muster a smile, but it felt forced and thin. "It's nothing, really. Just something personal," she replied, her voice barely steady. She lowered her eyes, hoping he would let it drop. But Jack wasn't the type to be easily dismissed. Jack adjusted his tie, leaning in slightly. Sometimes sharing helps. "I know a troubled look when I see one," he said, his voice calm but insistent. There was something about his presence, a steadiness, an unwavering confidence, that made Alina feel safe, as though she could let her guard down, if only for a moment. With a sigh, she glanced around the table. The others were engrossed in conversation, oblivious to the exchange. She looked back at Jack, seeing the genuine concern in his eyes, and something in her crumbled. She had been carrying the burden of her heartbreak alone for too long. Slowly, she began to speak, her voice quiet, almost hesitant at first, as she told Jack about Alex, about Chloe, and about the wedding invitation that had shattered her already fragile heart. Jack listened without interrupting, his eyes never leaving hers. He nodded occasionally, his expression unrentable but attentive. When she finished, Alina felt an odd mix of exhaustion and relief. It had been so long since she had let anyone in, and now that she had, she felt lighter, even if only slightly. Jack leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping thoughtfully on the table. "You know," he began, a glint of something mischievous in his eyes. "I think we should go to that wedding." Alina blinked, taken aback. "What?" "No, absolutely not," she replied quickly, shaking her head. The idea was absurd. The last thing she wanted was to attend the wedding of her ex-fiancé and her former best friend. The thought of seeing Chloe in her white dress, smiling up at Alex, filled her with dread. Jack, however, was undeterred. "Think about it," he said, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "Imagine the look on their faces when you show up, not alone, but with me by your side." He paused, letting his words sink in. "They expect you to be broken, Alina. They expect you to hide away. But what if you showed them that you're not the woman they think you are?" Alina hesitated. She could picture it, walking into that wedding, holding her head high, with Jack beside her. She could see Chloe's face, her smug smile faltering, her eyes widening in surprise. She could see Alex, his gaze flickering with regret, realizing that she was stronger than he ever gave her credit for. It was a tempting thought, a fantasy that made her feel a small spark of defiance, something she hadn't felt in a long time. But then fear crept in, the fear of vulnerability, of exposing herself again. "Jack, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I don't know if I can face them," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack reached across the table, his hand covering hers. His touch was warm, grounding her in the moment. "I understand," he said, his tone gentle. "But I believe in you, Alina. You deserve to move on, to show them, and yourself, that they didn't break you." He smiled then, a real warm smile that reached his eyes. "Besides, I think it could be fun." She looked at him, at the confidence in his gaze, and something shifted inside her. Maybe it was Jack's unwavering belief in her, or maybe it was the spark of rebellion that refused to be extinguished. Slowly she nodded. "All right," she said, her voice firmer now. "Let's do it." Jack grinned, his eyes glinting with a mix of excitement and something else, something Alina couldn't quite name. "That's the spirit," he said, his voice low and filled with promise. As he pulled his hand away, Alina felt a strange warmth linger where his fingers had been, a feeling that settled in her chest, making her feel alive. As the night continued, Alina couldn't help but glance at Jack from time to time. There was a quiet strength about him, a confidence that made her feel, for the first time in a long time, that maybe she wasn't alone. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new, something that went beyond revenge, beyond proving herself. Maybe this was about finding her own way, her own happiness. And as she thought of the wedding, of facing Chloe and Alex, not as a victim, but as a woman reborn, she felt a thrill of anticipation, a hunger for closure that had been denied her for too long. It was time to turn the page, to start a new chapter, one where she was no longer defined by the people who had tried to break her. And Jack was offering her a chance to do just that. Alina knew it wouldn't be easy, but as she looked at Jack, she found herself daring to hope again. And perhaps, for now, that was enough. The morning sun peeked through the curtains, bathing the room in a soft golden glow. Alina Harper stood in front of her mirror, her fingers nervously smoothing the fabric of her dress. The sleek, emerald green evening gown shimmered in the light, hugging her curves in a way that made her feel both powerful and vulnerable. She had chosen this dress specifically for the occasion, a mix of elegance and confidence, a symbol of her intent not to shy away. But now, standing there, doubts swirled in her mind. Could she really go through with this? Could she truly face Chloe and Alex and pretend she wasn't breaking inside? Alina closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. The memories of the betrayal cut deep. Alex holding Chloe's hand, Chloe's smug smile when Alina had confronted her, the way they had both looked at her as if she were nothing more than a forgotten piece of their past. The doorbell rang, jolting her out of her thoughts. Her heart skipped a beat, and she hurried to open the door. Jack Montgomery stood there, his presence commanding and confident. He wore a tailored black suit that fit him perfectly, his crisp white shirt open at the collar, revealing just a hint of ruggedness beneath his polished exterior. Jack's dark eyes sparkled as he looked at her, his lips curving into a smile. "You look stunning, Alina," he said, his voice warm, genuine. Alina felt a blush rise in her cheeks, a mix of embarrassment and something else, something that made her heart flutter in a way she hadn't expected. "Thank you," she managed, her voice steady though her pulse raced. Jack offered his arm, and Alina hesitated for a moment before taking it, the feel of his strong arm beneath her fingers grounding her in the reality of what they were about to do. They walked to the waiting limousine, its sleek black body gleaming in the driveway. Jack opened the door for her, a gesture that felt oddly intimate, like the start of something new. As they settled inside, the driver took off, and Alina found herself staring at the passing scenery, the city slowly transforming from familiar streets to the opulent suburbs where the wedding was being held. The silence between them was charged, an undercurrent of emotions neither had fully voiced. Jack glanced at her, his eyes softening as he noticed her fidgeting with her hands. "Nervous?" he asked, his tone gentle but with an edge of challenge. Alina looked at him, meeting his gaze. "A little," she admitted. I don't know if I can face them and keep it all together." Jack nodded, his expression turning serious. "You know, sometimes we're stronger than we give ourselves credit for," he said. "And remember, I'm here. You're not facing them alone." He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Besides, I have a feeling we're going to have more fun than they ever expected." Alina raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the twinkle in his eyes. "Fun?" she asked, the corner of her mouth lifting in a hesitant smile. Jack's mysterious demeanor hinted at more than he was letting on. Jack smiled, a mischievous grin that hinted at something deeper. "I have a plan," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "But for now, let's just say it involves a bit of surprise, a dash of revenge, and making sure you walk away from this with your head held high." Alina's breath caught at the intensity in his gaze. There was something in Jack's tone, in the way he looked at her, that made her think this wasn't just about helping her. It felt personal, as if Jack had something of his own at stake here. She studied him, curious. Jack had always been a guarded man, kind and attentive, but always with a certain distance. Now, though, she saw a glimpse of something else, a vulnerability that made her wonder what exactly had drawn him into her battle. They arrived at the venue, the grand estate where the wedding was being held, its sprawling gardens filled with flowers and perfectly manicured lawns. As the limousine rolled up the driveway, Alina took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it. There was no turning back now. Jack opened the door, stepping out before turning to help her out of the car. As she placed her hand in his, Alina felt a surge of strength, a determination that settled in her bones. They stepped out together, Jack's arm around her waist, his touch protective yet intimate. Heads turned almost immediately, whispers rippling through the gathered guests. Alina saw Chloe and Alex standing at the far end of the garden, their eyes widening in shock as they caught sight of her. Chloe's smile faltered, her gaze narrowing as she took in the sight of Jack's arm around Alina. Alex, on the other hand, looked stunned, his eyes flickering with disbelief. Alina's heart raced as she watched the expressions change on their faces. It was everything Jack had promised and more. Chloe's confidence crumbling. Alex's regret visible in the way his eyes darkened, his gaze lingering on her longer than it should. Jack leaned closer to Alina, whispering softly in her ear, "Remember, we're here for you. They don't get to win today." His words sent a shiver down her spine, and she nodded, her lips curving into a smile that was both confident and challenging. They walked through the crowd, Jack introducing her to people she didn't know, his charm undeniable. He was charismatic, commanding the attention of everyone they met, and Alina couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. She was no longer just the abandoned fiancée. She was a woman who had come with someone who made even the wealthiest guests stop and take notice. As they approached Chloe and Alex, Jack paused, his gaze hardening slightly. He smiled, but there was an edge to it, a steeliness that made Alina's heart skip. He extended his hand to Alex, who hesitated before shaking it. "Congratulations," Jack said, his voice smooth but carrying an undertone that made Alina shiver. "It's a big day for you too." Chloe's eyes darted between Jack and Alina, her smile forced as she responded, "Alina, I'm so glad you could make it." Her tone was sugary sweet, but the edge of discomfort was unmistakable. "And I see you brought a friend?" she added, her gaze shifting to Jack, trying to mask her unease. Jack's smile widened, his eyes never leaving Chloe's. Yes, I thought Alina could use some support today. And besides, he said, his gaze flickering to Alex, I wouldn't miss this for the world. Alina saw Alex's jaw tighten, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked at Jack, as if trying to assess his intentions. Chloe's smile wavered, her eyes filled with questions she was too proud to ask. Jack's hand settled on Alina's waist, his fingers pressing gently against her, a silent reassurance that he was there. As the ceremony began, Alina stood by Jack's side, her head held high, her gaze never wavering. She watched as Chloe and Alex exchanged vows, their smiles strained, the tension between them palpable. Jack leaned in, his lips brushing against her ear as he whispered, They're crumbling. Just look at them. You're winning, Alina. A thrill ran through her at his words, a sense of power she hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't just about hurting them. It was about reclaiming herself, about proving that she was more than what they had tried to make her. And as she looked at Jack, at the way his eyes held hers, she felt a connection, an understanding that went beyond words. He was here for her, not just to make a statement, but to show her that she was worthy of so much more. When the ceremony ended, Jack led her to the dance floor, his hand never leaving hers. The music played softly, and they moved together, his body close to hers, their movements fluid and synchronized. Alina felt the eyes of everyone on them, Chloe, Alex, the guests. But for once, she didn't care. She was in the moment, with Jack, his presence steadying her, grounding her. Jack looked down at her, his gaze intense, and for a moment, it felt like there was no one else there, just the two of them. He smiled, his hand tightening slightly on her waist. I told you we'd have fun, he said, his voice a low murmur. Alina smiled back, her heart swelling with something she couldn't quite name. Thank you, Jack, she whispered, for everything. Jack shook his head slightly, his eyes softening. You don't have to thank me, Alina. I'm just glad to be here with you. As they spun around the dance floor, Alina realized that this was more than just a moment of revenge, more than just an act of defiance. It was the start of something new, something she hadn't dared to hope for. And as Jack held her close, Alina knew that she was finally ready to move forward, not just away from the past, but towards something better, something real. This wasn't just about Chloe and Alex anymore. It was about her and Jack, and whatever might come next. And as they danced beneath the soft glow of the lights, Alina felt, for the first time in a long while, that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The evening wore on with an elegance that masked the cracks just beneath the surface. Guests flowed through the expansive hall of the estate, their chatter a constant hum, the champagne flowing freely, laughter ringing out intermittently. Alina stood by Jack's side, a glass of champagne in her hand, her eyes scanning the crowd. She couldn't deny the thrill of being there, the satisfaction of seeing Chloe's faltering confidence and Alex's discomfort. For once, she was the one in control. Jack was ever the gracious companion, effortlessly mingling with guests, introducing Alina as if she was the most important person in the room. His charm was disarming, his ease contagious, and Alina found herself smiling more freely than she had in months. But beneath her smile, there was a storm, a swirl of past hurts, present confidence, and a future she was beginning to see in a new light. As they made their way through the crowd, Jack paused, his eyes locking on Alex, who was speaking with a group of guests near the bar. Jack turned to Alina, his expression turning serious. I think it's time for a little chat, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Alina frowned, unsure of what he meant, but the glint in his eyes told her that whatever he was planning, it was important. He gave her hand a gentle squeeze before stepping away, moving toward Alex. Alina watched, her heart pounding. She wasn't sure what Jack had in mind, but she trusted him. There was something about the way he carried himself, the confidence that seemed to radiate from him, that made her believe everything would be all right. She watched as Jack approached Alex, their eyes meeting. Jack smiled, extending a hand. Alex hesitated, then shook it, his expression guarded. The exchange was too far for Alina to hear, but she could see the tension in Alex's posture, the way his smile seemed forced, as if he were struggling to maintain his composure. Jack leaned in, saying something that made Alex's eyes widen slightly, his face paling. Whatever Jack was saying, it was having an effect. Alina felt a mix of curiosity and anticipation, her mind racing with possibilities. Chloe, who had been chatting with some guests nearby, noticed the exchange and began making her way toward them, her eyes narrowing. Alina saw her approaching and instinctively moved to intercept her. She couldn't hear what Jack was telling Alex, but she knew it was something that mattered, something that Chloe might want to interrupt. "Chloe," Alina called, her voice smooth as silk. Chloe turned, her smile tight, her eyes flashing with irritation at being stopped. "Alina," she replied, her tone sweet but dripping with barely concealed contempt. "You seem to be enjoying yourself," Chloe added, her eyes flickering to Jack and Alex. Alina nodded, stepping closer, blocking Chloe's view of the two men. "I am. It's been a lovely evening," she said, her smile unwavering. Chloe's eyes narrowed, suspicion evident in her gaze. Alina could almost feel the frustration rolling off Chloe. This wasn't how she had planned the night to go. Chloe had wanted her to be miserable, to break down in the face of their happiness. Instead, Alina was here, standing tall, unfazed. "I must say, Chloe, you look beautiful," Alina added, her voice perfectly calm. It was true. Chloe looked radiant in her designer wedding gown, her hair styled to perfection. But beneath the surface, Alina could see the cracks, Chloe's uncertainty, her fear that this perfect image was slipping out of her control. Chloe forced a smile, her eyes still darting past Alina, trying to catch a glimpse of Alex and Jack. "Thank you, Alina. It means a lot that you're here today." "Really, it does," she said, her voice saccharine sweet. Alina leaned in slightly, her smile never faltering. "I wouldn't have missed it," she said, her tone carrying a hint of something more. A challenge, a declaration. Chloe blinked, her smile faltering for just a moment, and Alina knew she had struck a nerve. Meanwhile, Jack and Alex's conversation was growing more intense. Jack's voice was low, almost a whisper, but the effect was clear. Alex's face had gone from pale to flushed, his jaw clenching, his eyes darting toward Chloe, and then back to Jack. Jack smiled, a cold, calculated smile that sent a shiver down Alina's spine, even from across the room. Jack finally stepped back, his expression turning pleasant once more, as if the entire conversation had been nothing more than a polite chat. Alex, however, looked shaken, his hands trembling slightly as he picked up a glass of champagne from the bar. Jack turned, his eyes meeting Alina's, and he gave her a subtle nod, a signal that whatever needed to be done was done. Alina excused herself from Chloe, giving her one last smile before making her way over to Jack. Her heart pounded with anticipation, her mind racing with questions. As she approached, Jack took her hand, leading her away from the crowd, away from prying eyes. "What did you say to him?" Alina asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack paused, glancing around to make sure they were alone before he spoke. "I made an investment recently," he said, his voice calm, his eyes locking onto hers. Alina frowned, not understanding. Jack continued, his voice lowering, a hint of amusement in his tone. "I bought the controlling share in the company Alex works for. As of tonight, I'm officially his boss." Alina's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. You bought his company?" she repeated, her voice filled with disbelief. Jack nodded, his lips curving into a smile. "He doesn't know what to do with himself right now," Jack said, his voice filled with satisfaction. "I wanted to make sure that when you walked away from this night, you did so knowing that you were in control. Not him, not Chloe. You." Alina felt a rush of emotions, shock, disbelief, but also a deep, profound sense of satisfaction. This was more than she had ever hoped for, more than she had imagined when she agreed to come to this wedding. Jack had given her the power back, had shifted the balance in her favor in a way that was undeniable. She looked up at Jack, her eyes filled with emotion. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Jack reached up, brushing a strand of hair away from her face, his touch gentle. "Because you deserve better, Alina," he said, his voice soft. "You deserve to know that you're worth fighting for, that you're not alone. His eyes searched hers, his gaze intense. "And because I care about you." Alina's breath caught at his words, her heart swelling with an emotion she couldn't quite name. She had come here expecting a night of discomfort, of facing her past, but instead she had found something else, something deeper, something real. Jack had been there for her, not just to make a statement, but because he truly cared. And as she looked into his eyes, Alina realized that she cared about him too. The sound of laughter and music drifted toward them, a reminder of where they were. But for a moment, it felt like they were in their own world, away from the chaos, away from the past. Jack's hand cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing lightly against her skin. "You don't have to be afraid anymore, Alina," he whispered. "Not of them, not of anything." Alina nodded, her eyes never leaving his. For the first time in a long time, she felt safe, felt like she could finally let go of the fear and the pain that had held her captive. Jack leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, his breath warm against her skin. "We're in this together," he whispered, and Alina knew that he meant it, that he wasn't going anywhere. She closed her eyes, letting the moment wash over her, letting herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she had found something worth holding on to. And as Jack pulled her into his arms, holding her close, Alina knew that whatever came next, she was ready to face it. Together, they were unstoppable. And that, more than anything, was the revelation she needed. The music floated through the air like a soft caress, and the guests mingled in small groups, their laughter echoing beneath the grand chandelier that illuminated the ballroom. Alina stood by Jack's side, her fingers loosely interlaced with his, a glass of champagne in her other hand. There was an electricity between them, a spark that hadn't been there before tonight. Everything was changing, shifting, and it made Alina's pulse quicken. Chloe was trying hard to maintain her composure, her smile fixed, but her eyes betraying her unease. She watched as Alina and Jack moved effortlessly through the crowd, their heads close as they spoke in hushed tones, sharing laughs that seemed entirely genuine. Chloe's gaze flickered to her new husband, Alex, who stood off to the side, looking lost in thought, his eyes constantly drifting back to Jack and Alina. A pang of jealousy twisted in Chloe's gut, and she forced herself to smile wider, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. Jack leaned closer to Alina, his lips brushing against her ear as he whispered, "Look at them, trying to keep it together. I almost feel sorry for them." His voice held a hint of amusement, and Alina's lips curved into a knowing smile. She glanced in Chloe's direction, watching as her former best friend struggled to maintain her mask of poise and confidence. There was something deeply satisfying about it, watching Chloe scramble, knowing that her meticulously crafted plan was crumbling in front of her eyes. Alina had once felt so small, so insignificant in the shadow of Chloe's ambitions, but tonight she felt powerful. Jack's presence beside her was grounding, a reminder that she wasn't that broken woman anymore. He squeezed her hand gently, his eyes meeting hers, and Alina felt a warmth in her chest that made her heart flutter. She had walked into this wedding expecting only to survive it, but Jack had given her more than that. He had given her the chance to thrive. The evening's festivities continued, with guests drifting to the dance floor as the tempo of the music picked up. Jack led Alina to the dance floor, his hand resting on the small of her back. The touch was possessive yet protective, and Alina welcomed the warmth of it, feeling her confidence grow. As they moved to the rhythm of the music, Jack's eyes never left hers, his gaze intense, focused, as if nothing else mattered. They spun together, the crowd around them blurring into insignificance. Alina allowed herself to let go, to be free in Jack's arms, to feel the thrill of the moment. The world around them ceased to exist. No Chloe, no Alex, no past filled with betrayals. It was just her and Jack, the music, and the steady beat of her heart. Out of the corner of her eye, Alina noticed Chloe standing at the edge of the dance floor, her expression frozen as she watched them. Alina smiled, a quiet, almost imperceptible smile that held an edge of triumph. Chloe had always been the one in control, the one who pulled the strings. But tonight, the tables had turned. Jack leaned down, his lips brushing against her ear. "Chloe's staring," he murmured, his voice laced with a hint of mischief. "Think she's wondering what she's lost." Alina chuckled, a low sound that made Jack's eyes glint with satisfaction. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze locking with Chloe's. There was no malice in her eyes, just confidence, the knowledge that she no longer needed Chloe's approval or validation. It was freeing, this realization that she could let go of the past and the person Chloe had made her believe she was. Jack's eyes searched her face, his expression softening. "You know, you're beautiful when you're not holding back," he said, his voice low. Alina felt her cheeks warm at the compliment, her heart skipping a beat. She looked up at Jack, seeing something in his gaze that took her breath away, something raw, unguarded. "Thank you, Jack," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the music. His hand on her back moved, his fingers brushing against her bare skin, sending a shiver down her spine. Jack pulled her closer, his body warm against hers, his breath against her temple. "Tonight isn't about them anymore, Alina," Jack said, his voice filled with emotion. "It's about you, about us. Whatever happens after this, it's just you and me." Alina closed her eyes, letting herself fall into the moment, into the warmth of Jack's embrace. She didn't need to prove anything to Chloe or Alex anymore. She was here for herself, for the new possibilities that were unfolding before her. Suddenly, Alex appeared at the edge of the dance floor, his eyes fixed on Alina and Jack, his expression conflicted. Jack noticed, his gaze flickering to Alex, his smile turning into something more predatory, something that made Alina's pulse quicken. Jack paused their dance, his eyes narrowing as he watched Alex approach. "Alina," Alex said, his voice tight, strained. Jack's arm tightened around her, his expression hardening. Alina glanced between them, her eyes narrowing slightly. There was an unspoken tension between the two men, something that went beyond just business or rivalry. It was personal now. "What do you want, Alex?" Jack asked, his tone smooth, but with an edge that made Alina's heart pound. There was something territorial in Jack's stance, in the way he held her close, as if daring Alex to make a move. "I need to speak with Alina," Alex said, his eyes flickering to Jack. "Alone." Alina's heart skipped a beat, her mind racing. She looked at Jack, his eyes meeting hers, a question in his gaze. She nodded slightly, and Jack slowly let go of her, his hand lingering on her waist for a moment longer. "I'll be right here," Jack said, his eyes locking onto Alex's. It was both a promise and a warning. Alex led Alina away from the dance floor to a quiet corner of the ballroom. He turned to her, his expression softening, the anger and tension melting away, replaced by something almost vulnerable. "Alina, I didn't know you'd come," he began, his voice low. Alina crossed her arms, her gaze steady. "You invited me, Alex. Did you think I'd just hide away?" she replied, her tone calm. Alex looked away, his jaw clenching. "I made a mistake," he said, his voice barely audible. I thought Chloe was what I wanted, but seeing you here tonight, seeing you with him, I realized that I made the worst mistake of my life." Alina blinked, her heart pounding in her chest. She took a step back, her eyes narrowing. "You don't get to do this, Alex," she said, her voice growing stronger. "You don't get to walk away and then decide you want me back just because you think I've moved on." Alex reached for her hand, but Alina pulled away, her gaze hardening. "You made your choice, and I've made mine. I'm with Jack now, and I'm happy," she said, her voice filled with conviction. She turned away, her heart racing, and began to walk back toward Jack, who was watching them, his eyes filled with concern. As she reached him, Jack pulled her into his arms, his eyes searching hers. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. Alina nodded, her hands resting on his chest. "Yes," she said, her voice filled with certainty. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Jack's eyes softened, and he leaned down, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. Alina closed her eyes, letting herself fall into the warmth of his embrace. It was the start of something new, something real, and as she looked up at Jack, she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. And for the first time in a long time, she felt truly at peace. The power had shifted, and she was ready for whatever came next, hand in hand with the man who had shown her what it truly meant to be loved. The first rays of dawn broke through the curtains, bathing the room in a golden glow. Alina Harper opened her eyes, her body sinking into the warmth of the bed, the events of the previous night replaying in her mind. The wedding was behind her. Chloe's carefully constructed facade had crumbled. Alex's regret had come too late, and she and Jack had walked away victorious. But this morning was different. There was no longer a need to prove herself, no need to look back. She had emerged from the shadows of betrayal, and a new chapter was beginning. Alina turned her head and smiled at the sight of Jack beside her, his arm lazily draped across her waist. His dark hair was tousled, and his expression, even in sleep, was peaceful. She reached over, brushing a stray lock away from his forehead, her heart swelling with warmth. Jack stirred, his eyes slowly fluttering open. When he saw her, his lips curved into a lazy smile that made her pulse quicken. "Morning," he whispered, his voice still husky from sleep. He tightened his arm around her waist, pulling her closer. Alina let out a contented sigh, resting her head on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. "Morning," she replied, her voice soft. They stayed like that for a few moments longer, enjoying the silence, the peace that had eluded her for so long. Jack's fingers traced patterns along her back, and Alina closed her eyes, savoring the moment. She had spent so much time wrapped in her own pain, in the betrayal that had torn her apart. But Jack had pulled her out of it. He had shown her that there was still joy to be found, still hope. Jack shifted, rolling onto his side so that he could look at her. His gaze was soft, filled with something that made her breath catch in her throat. He reached up, brushing his thumb along her cheek, his touch gentle. "You know, I don't think I've ever been happier than I am right now," he said, his voice filled with emotion. Alina's eyes softened, her heart swelling at his words. She leaned in, her lips brushing his in a soft kiss. Jack deepened the kiss, his hand cupping the back of her head, his body pressing closer. Alina could feel the warmth of his skin, the strength in his touch, and it sent a thrill through her. When they finally pulled away, Jack's eyes were dark, his gaze intense as he studied her. "I know this started as a plan to help you get back at them, but it's more than that for me now," he said, his voice low. "I've fallen for you, Alina, completely." Alina felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, her heart pounding in her chest. She reached up, cupping his face in her hands. "I've fallen for you too, Jack," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You've given me something I didn't think I'd ever have again. Hope, love, a reason to move forward." Jack smiled, a smile that reached his eyes, making them glisten. He pulled her into his arms, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Then let's move forward together," he murmured, his voice filled with promise. No more looking back. They spent the rest of the morning wrapped in each other's arms, the world outside fading into insignificance. It was just them, and the love that had grown between them, a love that was strong and true. They had faced the past, and now it was time to look to the future, a future that was filled with endless possibilities. A few weeks later, Alina found herself standing in front of a room filled with employees, her employees. She had taken up her new role as the manager of the new branch of Jack's company, a move that had shocked everyone, especially Alex. The day Jack announced her appointment, Alex's face had turned ashen, his disbelief palpable. Alina had met his gaze, her expression unwavering, the power now firmly in her hands. She looked out at the faces before her, her heart swelling with pride. This was her new beginning, a chance to prove herself, not just to Jack or to the people who had doubted her, but to herself. She had fought for this, and she had earned it. Jack stood at the back of the room, his eyes never leaving hers. His presence was comforting, his belief in her unwavering. As she spoke, laying out her vision for the future of the company, she could feel his support, his love, and it gave her strength. When she finished, the room erupted in applause, and Jack was the first to step forward, his smile wide, his eyes filled with pride. "You were amazing," he said as he reached her, his voice filled with admiration. He took her hand, pulling her close, his lips brushing against her ear. "You're going to be incredible in this role, Alina. I always knew you would be." Alina smiled, her eyes shining. She looked up at him, her heart filled with love. "And I wouldn't be here without you, Jack," she said, her voice filled with emotion. Jack shook his head, his gaze softening. "No, Alina. You got here because of your own strength," he said, his voice sincere. "I just gave you a nudge. The rest, you did that on your own." Alina felt tears well up in her eyes, and she blinked them back, her smile widening. She leaned in, her lips brushing against his. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jack pulled her into his arms, holding her close, and Alina felt the world fade away. This was what she had fought for, what she had dreamed of, a love that was real, a purpose that was meaningful. She had found herself again, and this time she wasn't letting go. That evening, they returned to Jack's penthouse, the city lights twinkling below them. Jack poured them both a glass of wine, the deep red liquid shimmering in the dim light. They stood by the large windows, looking out at the sprawling skyline. Jack turned to Alina, his gaze filled with something that made her heart race. "There's something I want to ask you," he said, his voice suddenly serious. Alina looked at him, her heart pounding. Jack set his wine glass down, taking her hands in his. "Elena, from the moment I saw you standing at that business dinner, struggling to hold it all together, I knew there was something special about you. You're strong, resilient, and you have this light inside you that drew me in. I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you." He dropped to one knee, and Elena gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Jack pulled out a small box, opening it to reveal a sparkling diamond ring. "Elena Harper, will you marry me?" Tears filled Elena's eyes, her heart swelling with so much love she thought it might burst. She nodded, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Yes, Jack, I will marry you." Jack's face broke into a wide smile, and he slipped the ring onto her finger before standing and pulling her into his arms. He kissed her, a kiss that was filled with promise, with love, with everything they had fought for. As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, Alina knew that this was her new beginning. She had faced the darkest parts of her past, had found love in the most unexpected of places, and now she was ready to start the next chapter of her life, with Jack by her side. It wasn't just a new beginning. It was the beginning of a life filled with love, hope, and endless possibilities. And as Jack held her close, Alina knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. For the first time in a long time, she felt truly at peace, ready for whatever came next, hand in hand with the man she loved.